Good evening and welcome to the Newshour Agenda. On the show today, we have two guests joining us from Canada, where, of course, the relations between India and Canada, of course, have seen a lot of ups and downs over the past several days, particularly after the statements of the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, in Parliament, alleging some kind of action in terms of the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, who he blamed on actors who he associated with India. Now, this statement was made in the Parliament, but certainly this has caused a huge amount of consternation, not just here in India, but also in Canada. To talk about all of this, we're joined now by Member of Parliament Kevin Vuong from Canada. Also with us is former advisor to the Liberal Party, Julian Owens. I'm going to start with you first, Mr. Vuong, because your comments have been going quite viral here in India as well. And let me begin by asking you, why is it that you have sought proof of the Canadian government to provide this proof about the involvement of the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar? What has prompted you to question the claims made by your Prime Minister?
So, Madhav, I think there's a few things I'll say. I think first and foremost, the Canadian citizen was murdered, and that is a very serious thing. If there is any evidence that needs to be brought forward to the appropriate authorities and tried in a court of law, if the evidence substantiates that, I think to make public what the Prime Minister has described as, quote, credible allegations is concerning, but there have been no charges that have been laid yet. What's also concerning is for Jagmeet Singh, who is the leader, an opposition leader of the fourth party here in Canada, to somehow then upgrade what the Prime Minister has said in terms of credible allegations to, quote, clear evidence, end quote. And I think a lot of people are wondering, what has he seen or what does he have that makes him so confident to be able to say that? Because saying clear evidence is quite a significant escalation from what even the Prime Minister has said.
Absolutely. And, the question is this, that, after, when Mr. Jagmeet Singh comes out and makes these statements, and again, there is no response or clarification coming into that from Mr. Trudeau or members of his party, the question then arises, Mr. Vuong, and many in India are questioning, is whether this is nothing but coalition compulsions, whether this is more of a political nature of these allegations, because we all know that Mr. Jagmeet Singh and his party's leaders do support these Khalistani elements.
Yeah, so Madhav, I mean, it's no secret that both for the NDP as well as the Liberals, that there are 12 seats in British Columbia where the Sikh community plays a very important role in often determining the winner or the loser. I would hope that either of these leaders are not putting politics before the country and a very important relationship between two democracies at a time where the world is facing increasing instability, where authoritarian is on the rise, where democracies need to stand together, united to fight against that and stand up for a rule of law.
Absolutely. And, before I go across to Julian, one very, very important question that I also wanted to ask you. You mentioned a very important fact that these are mature democracies. But, in mature democracies, and you're a member of Parliament, we all know that all parliaments, there is a certain amount of immunity in terms of what one says and what legal action can be taken. But, many are saying that if you come out as a leader of one particular country, you may have had a difficult past few days here in India during the G20, but does that mean that such unsubstantiated allegations can be made in public? We were speaking a few days earlier to the former National Security Advisor of the United States, Mr. John Bolton, and he was of the view that there is nothing to be gained by making unsubstantiated allegations in public if you can't prove them, if you can't try them, for instance, in a court of law.
I think the challenge for a lot of Canadians is, I think, first and foremost, every allegation of foreign interference, and in this case, of a murder, should be taken very seriously. But I think people wonder about why go public with this and yet not really say anything with regards to the overwhelming amount of allegations with regards to foreign interference from the Chinese Communist Party. So much so that there are national security officials who have put their careers on the line to leak out that information to the free press here in Canada because they're so concerned about inaction. And I think a lot of people, myself included, are wondering, why the two distinct and very clear different approaches.
Right, right. Let me bring Julian into this. Julian, what's to be gained in your view? I just mentioned what Mr. John Bolton told us a few days ago, and even Mr. Vuong is, of course, demanding that this evidence be made public, because at the end of the day, if as a responsible, democratically elected leader, you're going to make charges, then there is also some amount of responsibility of seeing it through, because otherwise what's ending up happening, and we all know about the diplomatic standoff, is that you're actually threatening relations with what is otherwise a very important ally and a very important mature democracy with which Canada has had very friendly relations, even people-to-people contact.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. Look, I think foreign policy isn't so much about friendship, and it's not about the personalities of leaders. Bilateral relations are complex and include trade, people-to-people, security issues. And I think Canada-India relations are deep and long-standing, and will continue to grow once we deal with this really important issue that's before us. I find it a little bit surprising that in democracy as large and mature as India is, that we're not seeing some voices come to the surface and say, the quiet diplomacy was tried. Quiet conversations were tried. There were quiet visits by Canadian officials, very senior security officials to India. The leaders of the two countries discussed this individually. Why then did the Prime Minister, speak about this? And this is not the type of issue that's common in Canada, this type of murder, and it's incredibly serious, and it is not something that would be politicized by our Prime Minister. The dynamics of our politics apply, frankly, equally to most of our political parties. Yes, diaspora politics are important in a relatively young country like Canada. Yes, we have a large contingent of Sikh Canadians, of Punjabi Canadians, but we also have people of South Indian ancestry, and including in our cabinet, including among the opposition parties. So we actually have a very we now have a formal investigation underway into election interference in our country. Mm-hmm. There were two countries named in that investigation. The countries are China and Russia. Mm-hmm. But the justice who is running it, who is completely independent, can decide to look into other countries and other pieces of evidence. And I think one of the reasons the Prime Minister decided to speak publicly, in addition to the fact that it sounds like the information had made its way into the Canadian media and was about to be released, mm-hmm. is that he's very concerned about a precedent. Mm-hmm. That if he doesn't say something, that other countries, such as China perhaps, will see what has happened and feel that they can act with impunity in our country. And that is simply that's simply not the case. But
that's a bit incredible, Mr. Owens. That's a bit incredible, because you're risking the relations with a friendly country because of possible fears of other countries, which, as you yourself have described and Mr. Vuong have described, are clearly not democratic countries. I don't think that's even how they describe themselves. The world knows them to be autocracies. Surely there's a difference in the approach, and there has to be a difference in approach, because even Mr. Vuong expresses about whether this is nothing but vote bank politics or supporting parties, or however one chooses to articulate it, and domestic political concerns more than anything else. Mr. Owens.
I think Canada has not been trying to escalate the situation. I think they tried to deal with it quietly. I think they extended a number of courtesies officially and quietly to India that would certainly not have been extended to a country like Russia. And I'm not sure that they obviously weren't satisfied, with the response. I'll tell you, our securities agencies are not, cannot be politicized in the way that is sort of being popularized in some of the Indian press at the moment. And in fact, they have found ways to hold the government to account when they feel that something's being improperly politicized. So, however, because of the way intelligence is collected, often it requires that the evidence not be released generally, that they be dealt with by special courts. That's simply how it is. The problem is that with the Indian response and the lack of transparency in the response, that breeds further conspiracies. It breeds, for example, what has been reported today in Birmingham, in the UK, which is another group of people in the Sikh community who are very concerned about a death in their community. Mm-hmm. If the Indian government engaged with the Canadian government in a joint investigation, there would actually be a good cooperative response.
Well, perhaps
I think
so.
Bilateral.
Perhaps so, but Mr. Owens, the Indian government is more concerned about the lack of response from Canada to individuals such as Nijar, whose information was given. The kind of violent acts that he has engaged in. There were 17 cases against this individual. There are several dozen individuals such as these who are on Canadian soil. The Indian government is saying, look here, you're not acting upon those who are accused of violent crimes here in India. You're not taking action, and then you're bringing this particular information to us. So that's the kind of stand that has been taken by India. And certainly it is nobody's case that, any kind of extrajudicial or extraterritorial aggression should take place. But when one makes that claim, there has to be some amount of authenticity and responsibility with that. And can you deny the fact that today even Indian diplomats are facing threats? That's the kind of situation we're at today, Mr. Owens. Before I go back to Mr. Vuong, quick question to you.
Sure. We have our own multi-decade history with separatism and nationalism, mostly from Quebec, right? Where it stops at in our country is violence. So the free expression of those views is tolerated. It's not encouraged, but it's certainly tolerated. A lot of things are tolerated that fall outside the mainstream. But the police services operate independently here from political direction. They simply do. And so, I was chief of staff to our foreign minister. I think Canada is very concerned about its reputation as a place to host embassies and high commissions. Mm-hmm. I'm sure if there are real security threats, they will be dealt with seriously and vigorously. The Air India trial in Canada, I believe, is the most expensive trial in Canadian history. Violence, real examples of violence and terrorism, I'm pretty confident will be dealt with both by our agencies and our police force.
Okay, but many believe that even in the Air India case, justice was not done. And I can assure you there are several of our media and all who question not just our agencies, but also several aspects of that is very much there. I don't know the perception that you share. Yeah, all right. But let me bring in Mr. Vuong on that. Mr. Vuong, do you really believe that Canada did all it could? Because Mr. Owens would have us believe that, look here, the government took it up with the Indian government. But the point is that these things take time. The Indian government perhaps also had concerns that were not addressed. And that's something that the Indian government has been speaking about quite vocally.
So Madhav, I just want to touch on Air India. I think that process took 20 years too long to be able to seek justice. And even then, I think it was piecemeal justice. What I think it's very important for Canada and Canadians is that justice, again, a Canadian citizen was murdered. Justice must be sought for that as well, too. And it must not take as long as what, the families of the victims of Air India had to wait. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that I wish I saw a stronger position from the government on was when there were posters being circulated by individuals that were sympathetic to the Khalistani movement that specifically called out and targeted Indian diplomats.
Absolutely.
This included the Indian High Commissioner as well as the Consul General in Toronto and Ottawa. And Madhav, I've had the privilege of hosting both the High Commissioner and your Consul General in Toronto in my community, because like we were discussing earlier, Canada and India have long-standing people-to-people ties, relationships that go beyond just cultural. It's those shared values of democracy and rule of law, right? And so for me, I think it's important that, you know, the government take this seriously. And yes, there are obviously extra considerations, as Mr. Lewis alluded to, with regards to situations that are related to national security. But if you're going to make public such an allegation, I think it is fair for people to ask, okay, you want us to take that seriously. We're here. We're taking that at face value. Now, you know, when and where are the charges going to be laid? I also think it's fair, moving away from the Prime Minister and the government for a moment, to Jagmeet Singh, who isn't a national security expert, to somehow have gotten the briefing, the same one that the Prime Minister got, probably less, given that he's not the Prime Minister, to upgrade it from credible allegations to somehow clear evidence. Does he have more information that you know the rest of us aren't privy to? Because if he does, he has a responsibility and a duty to bring it to the appropriate authorities.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'd like you to answer that, Julian. Jagmeet Singh knows so much is a question being asked over here. And also, of course, a specific point I was making earlier. Which country will tolerate open threats to its diplomats? You mentioned that the line is crossed when one talks about violence. But what about threats of violence? They're out there. And incidentally, a few days ago, in the United Kingdom, an Indian diplomat was actually stopped outside a Gurdwara in Glasgow where he was going to go for a very peaceful gathering. He was blocked by supporters of Khalistan. So that threat is very real. We've seen attacks on consulates of India where Indian diplomats may be situated by supporters of Khalistan. And these are all facts. These are all recorded events.
You know, our Prime Minister and government face protests every day, people screaming crazy things at them, sometimes, you know, a few feet away, sometimes groups of them, you know, camped out a block or two from Parliament. But the Prime Minister doesn't deal with police matters, and the Foreign Minister doesn't deal with police matters, and the government doesn't deal with police matters. And, you know, if threats are made, they're brought to the attention of the police, and we have an imperfect but independent police service and judiciary, and it is really up to them to deal with it. We have a minority parliament.
But even here, death threat posters, sir, would you say that death threat posters should not be acted upon when there are incidents of violence that we've seen in US, in UK, and perhaps even in Canada, where such incidents have been happening? You know, somewhere or the other, many would say that the seriousness with which the Canadian administration should have reacted just wasn't there.
I think the police are the best people to determine whether a poster that's put up or an online message that's put up is a credible threat with something behind it, or free speech expression. The best people to do it. It doesn't belong in a politicized environment, and that's just not how our law works.
All right. Julian Owens as well as Kevin Vuong, I'd like to thank both of you gentlemen for joining us this evening and sharing with us your concerns, your perspectives. Certainly a very important issue here in India as well, because the Indian government also has asked Canada to downgrade the strength of its mission here to 40 diplomats. The deadline of that is the 10th of October. Canada has since asked for the matter to be discussed through diplomatic channels. The question being raised here in India is why diplomatic channels were not used in the first place. Gentlemen, for sharing with us your views so candidly, thank you so much for joining us.